So very happy to be here. And this is actually like an ongoing research I'm presenting, and it actually is a part of my ongoing study on vegan parenting. And once I started doing interviews with vegan parents to understand, their experience of what it means to be a vegan parent in kind of speciesist society and institutions, then I realized actually I have to look at those institutions more closely that enable or hinder, moving towards plant-based diets and food systems. So that's kind of like this presentation then focuses on that institutional aspect and kind of looking at the alliance of institutional speciesism and capitalism. And yeah, I changed slightly my title because I realized I have to cover like some other EU kind of policies which are shaping animal consumption. Right. So yeah, basically what I want to do is to study from vegan sociological and critical animal studies perspectives how institutional speciesism and capitalist interests are entangled in the European Union agricultural policy and the EU subsidies, which are quite significant. And specifically looking at the EU, they got this specific scheme for the education system. It's called the EU School Vegetables, Fruit and Milk Scheme. So like, and so kind of examine these sort of documents and like what's the rationale behind those subsidies and the whole agricultural policy. And then as part of that vegan parenting study, I want to illustrate the implications of these policies and these subsidies in everyday settings in early childhood education from the perspective of vegan parents. And I am from Estonia, and so this is a context I'm familiar with. And also I'm a vegan parent myself, so it's a very personal topic for me as well. And then I kind of my research is focusing on Estonia. I'm interviewing vegan parents here. And yeah, my plan is to do like a critical discourse analysis of these documents, and also looking at kind of national strategies. And yeah, I still haven't done a thorough discourse analysis. I'm just presenting some initial insights today. And of course, this is something I'm not gonna spend a lot of time talking about. So we all know about how eating other animals and ecological kind of crisis and the climate breakdown are linked. And there's if anybody, I can just recommend Richard Twine's latest book on this. I think it was titled Climate Crisis and Other Animals. It's an excellent book where he details all those links, And of course, animal farming is one of the key drivers of climate change. And recently I came across research that I thought that it put it really well to kind of really, they presented, a data to show that it's really impossible to mitigate the climate crisis without the changing our food system. So like even if fossil fuel use was ended like now or today, in fact, and we did everything else. And if we just left our food system in place, it's not possible to meet those climate goals. And I think in terms of terminology, in Richard Twine's book, it was quite well argued as well, like that the term Anthropocene has got some limitations. And it doesn't enable so well to understand and analyze the hierarchies between like human beings and different human societies and different groups in causing this climate breakdown and also the consequences. So I also prefer the concept of Capitalocene, which I think is more useful and also draws our attention to capitalism as one of those major systems that is, causing and exacerbating the climate breakdown. Of course, and then, going to this institutional level, there's been work outlining how institutions are anthropocentric and speciesist. David Nybert has worked on that, and I myself have done some work on institutional resistance to veganism, and particularly looking at the medical system and the nutrition establishment. For instance, the national dietary guidelines and how they shape the consumption of animals. And there's also work on how the education system is speciesist. For instance, Helena Pedersen has worked on that issue, how children are socialized to uncritically embrace animal consumption, objectification of the other animals, and viewing this as normal and natural and inevitable. And also she and with some colleagues have kind of challenged this and kind of thought of critical animal pedagogies, how we can, through the education system, challenge these views. And of course, David Nybert has also kind of outlined links between capitalism and animal oppression. And to talk about like institutions here, of course, the animal industrial complex is a prime example of how, you know, all these institutions that are intertwined with capitalism to kind of continue this idea that animals are commodities, and also, of course, on a symbolic ideological level as well. So, and yeah, there's a lot to talk about here, in fact, but I'll be a bit brief. And I think, you know, in transition into plant-based diets and veganism, institutional acceptance and support are of key importance, because institutions can enable individuals to make better choices, you know, or they can also, of course, hinder people from making better choices in terms of their food. So EU has actually some legally binding, it has entered into some legally binding climate commitments. There's the European Green Deal, and I have just got like some quotes from their actual, like what they say about these documents. So they strive to be the first climate neutral continent. I want to have no emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. And of course, there's the Paris Climate Agreement, which the EU signed. And in fact, when we look at this EU agricultural policy, then 1/3 of its entire budget is going to agricultural subsidies. So more money is given to animal farming and growing plants. They don't include the transition to plant-based diets, and even they're not advocating for a reduction of animal products in diets. So, and in fact, animal farming is depicted in this EU agricultural policy as sustainable and compatible with climate goals, despite the evidence we have that this is actually not the case. So, of course, this is enmeshed with capitalist expansion, and they kind of find this language too of their materials. They say that productivity increases per animal or per unit of land in a sustainable way could be envisaged. So they really like, they don't want to give up this idea of that, you know, of consuming animals and raising animals on this mass scale. So they talk about higher returns, you know, kind of just modifying the existing system. So one thing that I definitely see what's going on is that there's that idea of a techno fix, so this is sort of like wanting to use just new technologies, and there's like techno optimism, so new technologies to kind of solve some problems to make the existing system more efficient, but in fact not challenging the fundamental problems. And this is a very masculine thing. So what I'm doing is also some kind of research in men and masculinities, and critically looking at power relation in the context, and this aligns with a lot of this, with some ideals of masculinity, technological and eco-modern masculinities that, you know, kind of promote these techno fixes and do not address core issues that have led to the ecological crisis in the first place. And of course, this supports capitalist expansion. Yeah, so I don't have time to read out some of those quotes from the EU documents, but yeah, so basically, like, to get to this other scheme, which is huge in shaping sort of people's food practices and institutional catering, the EU fruit, vegetables, and milk scheme, which basically the EU allocates money to member states to distribute fruit, vegetables, and cow's milk in the education system. And there used to be separate schemes, and they put them together. And I think this move helps to sort of greenwash that scheme in a way, because the fruit and veggies are there. And there's a huge budget, and each member state can choose how much to allocate to fruit and veggies versus cow's milk. And several countries, I actually looked up in the documents, 8 member states have chosen to allocate more to cow's milk. And basically, the national strategies, they include the aim of increasing children's milk consumption, and basically the European Commission kind of talks about how the scheme supports educational measures, and yeah, so this relates to this whole idea of speciesist education. But yeah, no, I realize I don't have much time, and I'm sort of wrapping up. I have a few more slides. So yeah, this is, as I mentioned, like it's really important to consider the implications of these institutional measures. And I look at sort of early childhood education mostly in Estonia. and I did interviews with 25 vegan parents on how they navigate speciesist institutions. And a lot of the focus and for these parents too, the issue was on the food that is provided there. And in early childhood education in Estonia, if you're in public daycare, you do not get an alternative menu for your child if you're vegan. And yeah, that's not offered. And then parents have to somehow navigate this. And of course, this leads to a lot of potential problems like the exclusion of vegan children. And basically the parents are saying like that it's quite shocking how much cow's milk is in the menu. It's served in almost every meal. And this is like a typical public daycare weekly menu in Estonia. This is from my child's kindergarten in just like a random, just 1 week. It was in September that I just took this menu, and what I've highlighted here in different colors. So the purple one is like well, they've got cow's milk in the food, and the pink one is which has foods which have fish and meat. And basically, yeah. So in even yeah. So the milk that is the subsidies, it's sort of in the milk and veggies and fruits are in bold, so you can see there's quite a lot of it here. And yeah, I'm just wrapping it up. I know that my time is running out. So yeah, so basically the EU has no commitments to transitioning to a plant-based food system and no goals to reduce animal farming or eating animals. So instead they are kind of favoring these masculinized techno-fixes and wanting to continue current practices, but in a more sustainable way. And this cool fruit, vegetable, and milk scheme is presented as universally beneficial, and it relies on the taken for granted idea of cow's milk as natural and healthy drink for children, of course, and this is part of speciesist education. And what else I'll highlight here? Of course, the EU's commitments are contradictory. So, of course, you cannot really claim that you want to achieve your climate goals and sustainable futures while keeping this consumption of animals alive and sort of subsidizing it. And I think this has to do with really like willful ignorance too. Okay, so I really like now I'll stop because I have run out of my time, I think. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shrish Vijaya Sudharsan. This paper is, or was actually my dissertation for my master's degree in critical theory at King's College. And it's more theoretical than I guess a lot of sociology tends to be, but I think the title Specters of Carnism fits quite squarely with what I'm trying to do. So before I move on, I'd invite you to just take a second to look at this chart. Give you about 10 seconds to just see what's on screen. So the chart in front of you is a lie. At the very least, a part of it is obscured. As you can see, although I've shown how many humans and farmed animals die, I've deliberately not provided a timescale because the numbers are gargantuan. It would be futile to depict both human and non-human deaths side by side because the scale of one will inevitably invisibilize the other. The truth is, factory farms cause the deaths of 80 billion land animals every year. On the other hand, approximately 117 billion humans have lived and died not in a year, not in a decade, not even in a century or in a millennium. No, 117 billion humans is the number that have existed since the time modern Homo sapiens evolved some 192,000 years ago. Staggeringly, we farm more land animals every 2 years than the number of humans that have lived and died ever. This number does not account for marine animals whom we entrap in such titanic quantities that they can only be measured by weight. Although some sources estimate that it is roughly 215 billion at any given time. Why has such an egregious system not only survived, but thrived for 3/4 of a century? Why have we not taken collective action in the face of this crisis? Being uncritical about non-human exploitation is most often a consequence of generational habit rather than deliberate efforts at a dogmatic ideology. Food culture is largely a result of conditioning and is supposedly amoral, The normal nature of established practices is an obstacle to radical social justice movements and to uprooting the hierarchical status quo. And generational change, therefore, requires caring rather than punitive solutions. The sluggish crawl to a better future is compounded by meat subsidies, schemes such as Operation Flood or the White Revolution, livestock disaster assistance payments, corporate monopolies on food production, cognitive dissonance, or the meat paradox, as it's called, and speciesism, of course, and human bias. Beneath all of this is an infinitely more complex mechanism. It's a helical concept that functions in much the same ways as other psychoanalytic phenomena laid out in Hirsch, Abraham, and Harris, namely that it is transmitted generationally through tangible media and affective networks, and is a function of hiddenness, encryption, and repression. We may call this phenomenon intergenerational guilt, and we may place it alongside another neologism called postmemorial guilt. And I'm going to take credit for coining both of those things. My critique is primarily inspired by three texts: Marianne Hirsch's The Generation of Post-Memory, Mikhail Haneke's Caché, and Simon Amstell's Carnage Swallowing the Past. My paper addresses why guilt is a useful thing to study and why it has been underdeveloped historically, how guilt manifests itself as a dual truth alongside trauma, and in what ways guilt exists in relation to moral and political responsibility, how looking at guilt generationally lends itself to a more progressive and inclusive future that is at once cognizant of hierarchical power structures and their privileging of certain bodies, while remaining suspicious of neoliberal capitalism, statehood, and reductionist identity politics. Writing on the Holocaust, Marianne Hirsch posits that the transmission of traumatic and other memories is a culturally and generationally influenced process, intrinsically tied to family and tangible artifacts, which are, in her example, photographs. Quoting Eva Hoffman, she says, "The second generation is the hinge generation in which received, transferred knowledge of events is being transmuted into history or into myth. This involves a continually evolving, mutating network of remembrance, almost alchemical in nature, that engages with the past in increasingly intangible ways, all the while using tangible objects as medial bridges, which take on mythic proportions through their proximity to trauma, while also serving as reminders of a non-traumatic reality." In reality, photography and film are elevated even beyond Hirsch's proposition. For one, they allow for greater longevity than organic memory, because as substrate, photographs almost inevitably live longer than flesh. However, the obvious lack of a living interpreter makes the photograph's longevity memorially meaningless, synthetically intertwining it with matter's inevitable decay. The objects inherited by the post-memorial subject are recognitively linked to themselves, inextricably tying them to their past, but without which they simply would not exist. They realize the debt they thus owe to their post-memory. Photographs, in this way, also store memories, perhaps traumatic ones in this context, so that we do not have to, for fear of them being too painful. Naturally, the same is true of other physical objects. They serve as a form of cultural memory that is at once cathartic and indirect. Post-memory is thus a generative as well as a generational process in which truth is perpetually deferred. And in this difference, to quote Derrida, meaning is made. When Hirsch titles her essay The Generation of Post-Memory, she refers to this multiple idea that memory signals a continually belated origin at the same time as it is a hidden reality. The crucial feature of intergenerationality when referring to trauma and guilt is their repression. The introjection of trauma responses notably contrasts with the overt presence of post-memory. When events are transmuted, as Hoffman puts it, from memory to post-memory, they become tied to cultural artifacts. So in Mikhail Haneke's 2005 film, Caché, guilt is placed in conversation with trauma. While post-memorial subjects of direct trauma, subsequent generations of Holocaust survivors, for instance, or from slaves, they seek out media that grant a deeper insight into ancestral history. On the other hand, subsequent generations of oppressor cultures might experience avoidance or denial about their connections to oppression. In Caché, it is this starkly This, or rather, this tendency to behavior is starkly visible in the behavioral codes written into George's character, George being the protagonist. He experiences a lack of control over his own life. He feels threatened and blackmailed and wants desperately to find an outlet for his frustration. All of these symptoms are really no strangers to colonized peoples across the world who have, for a long time, written about dehumanizing and demoralizing effects of inherited and internalized colonial existence. That the protagonist evidently represses any association he may potentially have to causing trauma and remembers his parents as good colonizers is indicative of an intergenerational transmission of guilt. The self-victimization of oppressor cultures goes back centuries. For instance, framing colonization as a noble burden of civilization, the white nationalist idea of great replacement, Savarnas claiming Brahmin oppression, contemporary incel culture in light of #MeToo movements worldwide, or even religious bigotry against queer individuals under the guise of child protection and traditional values, and so on. The somatization of ghosts that we see in Cachet and in Hirsch is eloquently supported in Harris's Demons in the Consulting Room. A vital factor that thus links post-memory and intergenerationality is the continuous ontological thread between all forms of physicality. Mechanical objects become equally potent makers of meaning as organic bodies and minds. Just as ghostly symptoms of trauma can be somatized in organic human bodies, so can they be in extensions of those bodies as mechanical artifacts, photographs, videotapes, cartoons, and other tactile and kinetic media. So this revelation has rather transformative implications for classical accounts of trauma and of intergenerational trauma, making it nearly impossible to delimit intergenerationality at the level of the traditional family where it has often existed. Untraditional transferences beyond the traditional family, such as through friendship, kinship, or political solidarity even, occur just as frequently and strongly when post-memory is cited in shared communal spaces. Yasmin Vondenbergen, the fictional therapist in Simon Amstell's mockumentary Carnage, says at one point, "It's very cruel for youngsters today to ask, why did these people do what they did? We couldn't have known that we were active participants in the slave trade because the language at the time suggested we were just eating our dinner." This line makes several radical propositions. It recognizes the debilitating and traumatic effects of chronic guilt. It challenges anthropocentric accounts of slavery and exemplifies all of my original claims that food culture is largely a result of conditioning and is supposedly amoral. The normal nature of established practices is an obstacle to radical social justice movements and to uprooting the hierarchical status quo. And generational change, therefore, requires caring rather than punitive solutions. I think the most important thread that links Carnage to Hirsch and Haneke is its use and treatment of new media technology. A quarter of the way into the film, we are introduced to augmented reality technology that allows the 2067 generation to experience past events from the perspective of past people. Unsurprisingly, the way this technology is used in Carnage is through the young adults watching and feeling their predecessors eat meat. Their post-memorial guilt, as it were, is epitomized in their inexplicably masochistic urge to engage multisensorily with the past, despite knowing what horrors await them on the other side. It is telling also that only the youth are seen using the headsets. Those who live through the Carnist age embody instead intergenerationality and repressed guilt. If intergenerational post-memorial guilt can indeed be so acutely traumatic, then do we not have a responsibility to envision and work towards a future that is founded on an ethics of solidarity, of care, and of imperfection? To conclude, guilt is an uncomfortable subject to talk about because it is founded on recognizing oneself as one's own contradiction. It is founded on a basic premise that feeling guilty comes with a sense of unease about the often unconscious exercise of dominant power. Guilt is more often denied and repressed than accepted, so its chokehold requires amelioration. Such an act is made easier by recognizing guilt's communal, intergenerational, post-memorial nature. While individuals have agency and responsibility, progress need not be motivated by shame. The intergenerational transmission of guilt might occur with increased intensity in people that are situated at a greater remove from violence, like in classes that are engaged in the capitalist transaction of buying food from supermarkets, for example, rather than hunting. It is this remove itself, theorized as repression and willful denial, that enables the coexistence of guilt and trauma. Accordingly, collective inaction in the face of global crimes against more than humans, diagnosed as a result of intergenerational post-memorial guilt, can only be reversed by revealing the universal interconnectedness of all struggles against oppression. For instance, ecologically conscious, sufficientarian, and subsistence-oriented economic systems cannot possibly exist or be assimilated in capitalism while retaining their spirit, and as such require solidarity and organization across classes. Such solidarity obviously recognizes the inherently hierarchical nature of Carnism, and as the emancipatory saying goes, none are free until all are free. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Sullivan, and I'm a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. And today I'll be discussing the topic of the big boy burger versus animal and ecological justice, exploring the nexus of sport spaces, food consumption, and ecofeminism. This paper is a part of a larger project funded by the Shirk Insight Grant entitled Sport Should Not Cost the Earth, towards a multi-species equity-based sustainability supervised by Dr. Caroline Fusco. With multiple objectives of this grant, we are specifically focused on imagining alternative visions for the future of sports to address the often overlooked relationship between environmental and animal ecologies in sport. So to start, consumption habits are deeply intertwined with how we perceive the world and express culture. What we eat and where we eat it can reveal much about our social values and cultural identities. In the context of sport spaces, food is not just a matter of personal preference or convenience. It's a reflection of broader societal norms, particularly concerning gender and the environment. Yet despite literature on animals being used in sports and entertainment and the acknowledged link between animal agriculture and climate change, there remains to be a significant gap in critically examining the exploitation and cruelty inherent in animal consumption as food within sport, particularly concerning the intersection with masculinity. Therefore, the purpose of this paper is to investigate the persistence of traditional theories regarding masculinity, particularly those related to meat consumption within the social dynamics of sports stadiums, and to explore how food offerings within these venues reflect and perpetuate gendered and environmental norms within a patriarchal capitalist society. So to start, the literature focuses on two main themes, the first being beyond nutritional concerns to animal ethics. When you go to a stadium, what do you expect to find? Hot dogs, hamburgers, chicken tenders, nachos with cheese, the classics, right? Yet despite the central role of food in the stadium experience, current research tends to focus on aspects like nutritional value or fan satisfaction, often neglecting the excessive presence and consumption of animal-based food items. Such disembodiment, as many of us may know, is referred to the absent referent, in which we as consumers detach ourselves from reality of where our food comes from. We conveniently forget that the hot dogs or burgers were once part of a living, sentient being. The process of disconnecting from the animal's existence allows some to enjoy our meat without confronting its origins. And this disconnect has consequences. By separating the food from its source, we're perpetuating a cycle that obscures the reality of animal agriculture. So while the stadium may be a place of exhilaration and excitement, it's also a space where broader societal norms and expectations intersect with our dietary choices. In ecofeminist thought, patriarchal discourses tend to associate femininity with the environment, portraying it as something to be nurtured and cared for, much like the traditional roles ascribed to women. Conversely, men are often linked with dominance and control, reflecting societal views of their role in human culture. According to Carol Adams, meat consumption is deeply intertwined with ideas of masculinity, symbolizing male dominance and strength. This cultural portrayal as man as hunter reinforces the traditional notions of heterosexuality and masculinity, making men the primary target of societal pressures to consume meat. The historically gendered distribution of meat has imbued it with masculine attributes, leading to the perception that reducing meat consumption and increasing vegetable intake is a feminine behavior. Studies indicate that plant-based meat alternatives face resistance in consumer acceptance, with meat eaters viewing them as less masculine and appealing compared to traditional meat options. Despite the potential benefits of plant-based diets in mitigating global meat consumption and reducing environmental impact, their limited acceptance suggests a strong social linkage between food choices and gender norms. Moving on to methods. This study employed a summative qualitative content analysis with an ecofeminist, more than human theoretical framework. The analysis focused on the public websites of Canadian sports teams located in the 3 major cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and represented the Major League Soccer League, Canadian Football League, and National Hockey League. The examination of each stadium's websites aimed to identify and evaluate various aspects, including food offerings, sustainability policies, language, and use of imagery. The analysis revealed 3 key themes. The first theme is revealing the meat-centric nature of stadium food offerings. Data collection from 7 stadiums revealed a significant disparity in food offerings, with meat-based items prominently featured and easily accessible. Predominant choices included hot dogs, hamburgers, and barbecued meats. Even in cases where vegan options were available, they were often relegated to accidentally vegan items like potato chips, French fries, plain popcorn. More substantial plant-based offerings were extremely limited. Notably, only 1 stadium in Vancouver consistently labeled vegan items on their regular menu, and those options were only available at 2 sections within the entire stadium. So this spatial segregation reflects the broader marginalization of plant-based diets in the hyper-masculine environment of sports. The need to search for vegan options through separate links on stadium websites or request special modifications further highlights this marginalization. The visibility and accessibility of these options remain low, signaling that plant-based eating is an afterthought rather than a mainstream choice. This lack of integration into the regular offerings implicitly suggests that vegan diets do not belong in the typical sport stadium experience. The second theme is the masculine imagery in stadium food marketing. Analysis of the food names and description reveals a pervasive association between meat consumption and masculine imagery. For instance, the names, the Big Boy Burger, the Beast Ribs, the Carnivore All Beef Burger, all contribute to the marketing strategy by leveraging masculine imagery and associations to appeal to customers. The names evoke imagery of strength and dominance, associating the food items with an untamed masculinity. The word beast conveys a sense of power and dominance, appealing to customers who may be drawn to the idea of indulging in a hearty, carnivorous meal, reminiscent of a primal feast. Furthermore, many advertisements emphasize the quantity of meat-based meals, stating, "The Big Boy Burger features 2 patties, 2 slices of cheese, 4 slices of bacon with our special sauce on a toasted potato roll." This suggests the sense of indulgence and abundance and uniqueness to attract customers, reinforcing the association between meat consumption and masculinity within these sport environments. Now, the third theme is the illusion of ecological sports stadiums. While sports stadiums often advocate for sustainability, meat-centric offerings prevail, revealing a gap between rhetoric and reality. For example, 5 out of the 7 stadiums highlight waste reduction, water conservation, and carbon emissions on their websites, yet only 1 addresses food sustainability, a critical yet overlooked area. This focus on surface-level initiatives seem more geared toward enhancing the public image more than fostering substantial change. The promotion of meat-heavy, capitalist-driven food practices reflects this disconnect, perpetuating the systemic exploitation of marginalized communities and non-human animals. Ultimately, Patriarchal capitalism and toxic masculinity drive these patterns, with stadiums reinforcing meat consumption is a symbol of male dominance, exacerbating both social and environmental harm. To conclude, through this study, we hope to show that stadium functions as a nexus where broader societal norms intersect with our dietary choices, significantly shaping our understanding of meat consumption, masculinity, and sports culture. Here, the consumption of food goes beyond mere sustenance, serving as a reflection of deeply ingrained societal structures and values. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and it's great to follow up on such interesting presentations. So this is on ag laws and the connection between how John Sorensen applies his theories to ag laws, and I think it's an amazing book. So just a little about ag laws. They originated in the U.S. and they're in U.S., Canada, and Australia, mostly in the U.S. But the term comes from, it was coined by Mark Bittman, who wrote an article in the New York Times, and they're defined as any law that punishes undercover investigators, employees, or other onlookers for recording images or sounds at industrialized farming operations, so mostly factory farms, and then distributing those recordings to the public, to disclose to the public what is going on. And it's usually cases of extreme abuse and neglect, but it also, reveals what's going on an everyday basis in factory farms. So ag laws are really enhanced criminal trespass statutes. And of course, they're designed to protect factory farms from so-called interference by whistleblowers who record evidence and then, of all different types of things, not only the animal cruelty and abuse, but also food safety violations, environmental harm, worker safety violations, and then let it out to the public. So the whole goal of ag laws is to silence whistleblowers from revealing animal cruelty and abuse on factory farms, basically make it a crime to do it, to investigate, record, video, or photograph the activities on a factory farm. So really flipping the script and making it, instead of them being whistleblowers who are, letting society know what's happening, they become the eco-terrorists or the criminals. So there's been three major phases of ag laws. The first phase being in the early 1990s. A few states passed these first ag laws, and they were quickly labeled eco-terrorism laws. And the whole point was to deter animal rights activists from trespassing, causing physical property damage. In response, because there were some cases where, for example, mink were released from fur farms. But there's, as Sorensen points out, there's really, animal activists, as we know, are not violent. There has been, I believe, one death that was caused, but it's not as if, when you say terrorism, you do not think of animal activists letting mink go, for example. So these first string of laws were all about they contained provisions criminalizing recording on factory farms, so video or audio. Next, following up on that, is the Green Scare era. So this was from 2000 to 2015. This is when some of the undercover recordings show just horrific abuse of the animals on factory farms. And so the response to that, of course, was to ramp up, making it more of a crime for these whistleblowers. So they passed the Animal Enterprise Terrorist Act in the US. States followed these model ag legislation that were all about, punishing undercover investigations of factory farms and labeling it ecoterrorism. The final string of ag laws was really up till the present. A lot of them, luckily, are being struck down because they violate free speech, but some are still in existence, and they kind of keep getting more technological. For example, just in August of this year, one state, Kentucky, passed a law, and all of these laws are funded strongly by the meat industry. In Kentucky, it was the poultry industry, to ban drones, because that's kind of the latest, because undercover investigators are being punished harshly. The thought is, let's have drones go over and catch this footage. But now the laws are addressing that. And so to fly a drone over a confined animal feeding operation or meat processing plants is a crime as well. And Will Potter is one. He's written the books somewhat like John Sorensen on the criminalization of really animal activism, and how he explains it's there. The real purpose is, of course, to keep consumers in the dark, and not let them know what's happening in factory farms and slaughterhouses. To really kind of quickly take a look at the societal benefits, of course, of undercover investigations, we can go way back to Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, that was all about revealing what was going in Chicago's meatpacking plants. And because the important benefit of this kind of investigation is exposes what's going on, the animal suffering, the environmental harm, the human suffering of the workers. And it's pretty amazing what he did to write this book. He actually went undercover and lived with the workers in the meatpacking plants. And he lived with them, he spent every day with them, and just witnessed these horrors of the workplace and of what happened to the animals. And he called them the wage slaves, working on what he called the disassembly line, where the animals were disassembled as they went down the can't think of the name, the slide of the line. And it was filthy, contaminated. There were even horrible stories of people leaning down to kind of move these big vats of meat lard, and they would fall in and drown, and nothing was done about it. So just horrific explanation of what was going on firsthand. So one of the things that really struck me is, as Sinclair witnessed pigs going through what were called the killing gangs and down this disassembly line, he spoke so mercifully for the pigs. This was 1906, in a time when not many people were speaking mercifully for pigs. But he said even the most matter-of-fact person could not help thinking of the hogs. They were so innocent, they came so very trustingly, and they were so human in their protests and so perfectly within their rights. They had done nothing to deserve it, and it was adding insult to injury as the thing was done here, swinging them up in this cold-blooded, impersonal way without the homage of a tear. It was like some horrible crime committed in a dungeon, all unseen and unheeded, buried out of sight and out of memory, which is exactly, of course, what factory farms want to keep it as. But his portrayal of all that was going on, the abusive labor practices, the animal cruelty, the unsanitary conditions, it was listened to, and it actually paved the way for changes, for major reforms as far as federal legislation, reforming the slaughterhouses and meatpacking industry. Sadly, not so much for the animals, but at least it was listened to. Some action was taken. It caused a public uproar as they heard about all these horrors going on. And in response, President at the time, President Theodore Roosevelt, appointed a special commission to investigate, and it led to the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. So 1 year later, after this book was released, these laws were passed, far different from what we see now. Sinclair's, that's kind of interesting. One of the common quotes from Upton Sinclair was that he aimed at the public's heart, and by accident hit it in the stomach. So he was trying to reveal the harms that the workers were suffering, but the public was more grossed out by what was happening with the animals and the the contamination, people landing in the lard vat, and just the complete unhealthiness of the whole situation, and the thought that they were eating this food. So President Roosevelt, he called these investigative journalists such as Sinclair muckrakers, and they uncovered the dark side of society. So he said, when there's filth on the floor, it has to be scraped up with a muck rake. So the government at that time, they praised Sinclair. They acted in response. But today we see punishing, all we see is a response that punishes whistleblowers to protect the factory farms. And it's mostly because the powerful animal industrial institution has fueled this legislative effort to criminalize investigations. And in many of these states with the ag laws, the legislature is just, many are ranchers. It's just funded by the meat industry. And so basically they flip the script and punish the whistleblower rather than the wrongdoers. And so in Sorensen's book, which is amazing, that's the first time I got to read it, and I was just all the ideas that you don't really think of just come to light. And he described how the government uses social constructs of capitalism, speciesism, as these vehicles for transforming peaceful, and he emphasizes that how peaceful animal activists are, into eco-terrorists. And so what was once viewed as vital investigative journalism, such as Upton Sinclair, it's now become nothing but eco-terrorism, as if it takes place, of course, on a factory farm. And the oppressors use their wealth, their power to quash animal rights activists from exposing this cruelty, abuse, and really relentless exploitation of non-human animals in our capitalist society. So by criminalizing undercover investigations as so-called interference with animal enterprises, of course, what happens is it allows this exploitation, killing of animals to just keep going undercover and uninterrupted. And the corporations that profit from, of course, this exploitation, commodification of animals, use their power to influence the media, so in advertising, the government to define their critics as, extremists, eco-terrorists. We don't think of them as, oh, they're trying to help the animals. No, they become this level of eco-terrorism that tends to, of course, shift the focus from what's going on in the factories, the gruesome, shockingly brutal practices. And it's not just the ones that are, of course, as we know, just the horrific cases. It's all the standard practice in factory farms is horrific. So rather than having to defend the violence that these places are inflicting on billions of animals every year, industries then present themselves as they're the victims. They're the victims of these animal rights extremists and eco-terrorists. So that's why we need, of course, laws such as Animal Enterprise Act. Ag laws become necessary to protect the poor victimized corporations in the animal industrial complex. So it's pretty amazing how they switch the whole thing around to make themselves the victims. And just a quick example, I'm in Idaho, and this is one state that actually has struck down the ag law, but just a quick little background on it. This goes back to 2012. Mercy for Animals and some other animal rights organizations conducted this undercover investigation of a place called Betancourt Dairy's Dry Creek facility, and it uncovered this amazing video footage. And of course, the investigators such as Mercy for Animals will get a job there, and then as they're working, they're getting this amazing undercover footage and then releasing it. So it showed horrible footage, beating, kicking, stomping on, dragging dairy cows, and it was so shocking that it just went viral. It made headline news, prompted prosecutors to bring charges against 3 of the employees. And that's what too often happens, is the employees get targeted, which of course they were the ones doing the beating, but it's the larger system, of course, that should be targeted. So the Idaho Dairymen's Association went on this major offensive, and in response to this, instead of working to, try to remedy the animal abuse, no, they created an ag law to prevent these kind of undercover investigations, keep it all squashed down. So they called it the Interference with Agricultural Production Law. It turned undercover investigations into the crime of interference with agricultural production, punished by a fine of $5,000, 1 year in prison. So these are serious, if one of these investigators is caught, that's a serious punishment. And it included, the interference included causing physical damage, obtaining employment by misrepresentation, which of course is the way they would get in to do the undercover investigating, and then just recording the agricultural operations is itself a crime. So the Idaho Dairymen's Association and other agricultural organizations pressured the legislature to pass this security measure against these radical groups engaging in farm terrorism. And this, I love this cartoon because it really shows the absurdity of what goes on. Here's the agriculture person, the factory farm owner, who says, oh, these people are coming onto factory farms, shooting video horrific animal abuse and sharing it with the public. And so the senator responds, so we should pass laws outlawing this kind of abuse. And he's like, oh, good heavens, no, we simply want to make it illegal to show this to the public. And it really does. That's really what ag laws are all about, just gagging any kind of disclosure to the public. Luckily, this law was struck down. And it's an interesting decision because the judge in this case struck it down not only because it violated free speech, which under the U.S. Law is the First Amendment, but also said that it could not pass muster under the Constitution because it was motivated in substantial part by animus to its animal welfare groups. And so one quote from the case, the court pointed to conversations by the state legislators, and one of them in particular called them farm terrorists who use the media and sensationalism to attempt to steal the integrity of the producer and their reputations. Extremist groups who implement vigilante tactics to deploy self-appointed so-called investigators who masquerade as employees to infiltrate farms in the hope of discovering and recording what they believe to be animal abuse. So amazing the wording that they choose to really flip it around. So the court did held that this Idaho law violates the Equal Protection Clause because of this being animated by this improper animus to animal welfare groups. And so that case was a victory. And luckily many are. Oops, sorry about that. Whoops, it does not want to go to that map. There it is. So this is the latest map I could find as of last year. But as you can see, nothing has happened in several states, but certain states' legislation has luckily been, this is ag legislation, has been defeated. Quite a few there have been struck down, mostly on free speech grounds. And so still a lot of activity. Hopefully they will keep getting knocked down. And I will end on this famous quote from Paul McCartney. And I think it really speaks to how that's the problem, is that people don't see inside those walls because of laws such as ag laws. So thank you very much.